Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Jeff Cooper. I'm president of the board here, and I welcome you all to the Athenaeum, whether you're first-time visitors or frequent visitors or members or shareholders. It's great to have you. I know Nancy has a big fan club, and I welcome all of you as well. As many of you may know and have heard me before, I love to talk about the stories of why people come to the Athenaeum. Part of that is motivated by a member of our board, Nora Barry, who's here somewhere, who is a real great storyteller. And people come here and they either are here because they were doing research or because they live on the square and they saw the building and walked in and it was like another place to hang out or to read books, or they come here for a program, and it's wonderful that everybody walks in, feels at home, and then stays. My favorite stories are about how people at the Athenaeum come together and get to know each other and learn from each other. And Nancy Moses and I, for years, sort of were in similar circles, but never really knew each other. I'm not sure. I think our kids went to school together, so there was we sort of knew each other and had mutual friends. But then when we both joined the board here, I think at the same time, and I got to know Nancy, and that's one of my Athenaeum stories that is really helpful. I thank also another board member who's here, Scott Donahue, who's chair of our governance committee. So he manages who comes on the board. So getting to know Nancy was a really good story for me, a really good way of getting to know people. I learned about Nancy's history as a nonprofit executive, as a chair of the Pennsylvania Arts Council under Governor Tom Wolf, who's sitting in the back, very shyly, I would say. But I also learned about her interest in development and fundraising. Nancy is chair of our development committee, by the way, so a very quick pitch, whether you're a visitor, shareholder, member, or whatever, we rely heavily on contributions, so please consider that at the appropriate time when you're in a generous mood. I don't think Nancy minds my saying that, but that's a great story. And what's great about Nancy and what you will hear tonight is that Nancy is really a terrific storyteller herself. That's what her book is about, whether it's Orkney Islands or whether it's the Ukraine or whether it's Native America. Nancy tells stories about the preservation of history, the preservation of material, and so much of that is not only part of the places around the world that Nancy tells us about, but also so much a part of the history here of the Athenaeum as we preserve the architectural archives that are so critical to people in understanding the history of Philadelphia. But this book is about Nancy's travels, her experience, her research. I'm sure she has a great story to tell us tonight. And with that, Nancy Moses.
Does this particular artifact belong to anybody? You can pick it up after the speech. So thank you all for coming. It's very much fun to be with you today, to see so many friends of mine, to see so many people I know through the Athenaeum and have enjoyed meeting so much. And I want to give a special call out to a couple people who are here tonight. First of all, Carol Schloss and Darl Rastafer. Carol and Darl helped me do this book. We have been working together for maybe 15 years. We met through the Athenaeum, and it's been a very exciting experience working with you two. And thank you, Carol, for the cover. Darl's way in the back, thank you. I want to thank Linda Barnes, who checked facts and also did picture research. Peter Gold. Peter, where are you? Raise your hand. There's Peter over there. And Larry Wiseman. Where's Larry? Hi, Larry. Larry came all the way from Washington, D.C. The two of them read through my manuscript, gave me a lot of comments. Next, I'd like to introduce my family. Nella Bloom, Andrew Seberg, Bjorn Seberg, and Ed Seberg. And finally, of course, Myron Bloom, my rock, who's my first reader. On a dark and stormy night in 2500 BC, gusty winds and turbulent seas swept over a stone village, sending families fleeing from their home. On a dark and stormy night in 1850, gusty winds and turbulent seas sliced off the top of a mound, revealing the same stone village. Now, it's a chilly and stormy day in 2019, and I'm standing, Just a second. I have to figure out why this isn't working. Okay. Yeah. So I'm standing in the same village, and it is astonishing. This place looks the same as it looked 2,500 years ago. At least that's how it seemed. This place is called Skara Brae, and it eventually upended everything we know about Neolithic people, the late Neolithic people. It was first discovered by a guy named the Lord of Brecness, who was the richest guy in Orkney. He looked out of his window, it was 1850, and his window faced the ocean. It's a small island, most windows face the ocean. And what he saw was what was missing. There was a mound there that he looked at forever, but it was gone. So he went out to investigate, and what he discovered was the remains of a Neolithic community. It's a storied place, Skara Brae. It is older than Stonehenge. It is older than the Great Pyramids of Egypt. Skara Brae is the most well-preserved Neolithic farming community in Europe. And it's very vivid and evocative to be there. So when you go to most archaeological sites, well, it's basically two dimensions, right? You walk over the landscape and you look at what's there. Skara Brae is a whole different experience. It's three-dimension. You can walk around this 6,000-year-old village. You can peek inside the windows. You can peek inside the doors. You can see their stone beds, their stone dressers, their stone hearth, their proto-refrigerator. Its Neolithic residents come alive when you're there. You feel like you know these people. There's a lot of differences between Stone Age people and postmodern society, but Skara Brae, it invites you to suspend belief, to literally walk in Neolithic shoes. It also raises a host of questions. Who were these Stone Age people? How did they get to what looks to me like a very desolate island? The village was abandoned after 500 years. Why? These questions have drawn repeated generations of archaeologists from 1860 on to yesterday, and each generation adds to the story. So, how many of you have actually been to Orkney? Anybody here been there? Great. And how many of you saw the movie The Outrun? It was recently at the Bourse. Saw that movie. Well, then you get a sense of what Orkney was like. I'll just give you a snapshot. It's 70 little islands, 20 are occupied. It's 10 miles off the coast of Scotland, and the main island, which is the largest by far, is about 200 square miles. And in the middle of it is a World Heritage Site called the Heart of Neolithic Orkney World Heritage Site. People don't visit Orkney for the scenery because the landscape is really flat and stony. They don't visit for the single malt scotch, although they should because it's really good. They go for archaeology. Orkney is filled with archaeology sites, and one is more fascinating than the next. The Mesolithic, the Iron Age, the Vikings, but the sites that are most interesting of all are the Neolithic ones, from the Stone Age. And among these, Skara is the star. So people often ask, where'd you come up with the idea for a book like The Rescuers, and why Orkney? And so I thought I'd tell you a little bit about how I came up with this idea for a book. So it was during the pandemic. It had just begun. It was like March of 2020. And frankly, I was getting a little stir crazy. I just couldn't stand being home. So I started going to my office. And it looked like the people who had occupied that office had run fleeing from the pandemic home and left everything in situ. And that's what it felt like to be there. I was in a big space on the 19th floor of a building, B-grade office building on the corner of Walnut and 15th. And for many, many months, it was me and the guy at the front desk who were in this giant, big 19th story building. But I was there, it was quiet, and I thought, well, maybe I'll come up with a project that'll keep me busy during the pandemic. Nobody knew how long it was going to be, right? So what I decided to do was to check out an old file. I'd been keeping files on cultural treasures, stories about cultural property, for about 15 years, as long as I'd been writing books. And so I had a pretty big file. And I thought, well, maybe in there's something that'll spark my interest. And so I took all of the newspaper clips and I laid them out on the conference table and looked at them for a couple of days and rearranged them and stuff. And finally, something did come to me. I said that I write about objects. This time, what came forward wasn't the objects, but people, the people who had saved them, saved these cultural treasures from certain destruction in many cases. And I started thinking about them, and they seemed to me to be heroes in some way, that they had, for some reason, they were motivated to reach beyond themselves, to save important cultural treasures that they had no personal connection with in many cases. And I thought, let me think about writing about these guys. It's uplifting. It's a positive story. And so that's how I got into this. I had been to Orkney about 6 or some months before. My husband and I went to Scotland. He went on an archaeological excavation with Peter Gold, and I ended up in Orkney with a friend. And although I couldn't get there, I remembered a lot about it. And as it turns out, if you have a lot of time on your hands and patience, you can do a lot of research online, and you can find a lot about something you don't even know anything about, which is a Stone Age community on a remote island in the middle of the North Sea. So that's what I did. I read through every article I could find. I read through all of the professional journals. All the archaeologists who'd done work in Orkney had their work published in the Scottish Antiquarian Society journal. And so you could follow the archaeological excavations one at a time, over time, and see how people had treated that site and what they had learned and how the story had changed over time. And one of the things that I like to do the best when I write is to talk to people who are experts. Well, it's kind of hard to find an expert when you're sitting in Philadelphia who knows about Neolithic Orkney Island. But I started making calls, and I found a woman who, like me, was a member of the Forum of Executive Women. She's from Scotland. She had relatives on Orkney Island, on mainland, who she contacted them. They said, sure, we're not doing anything. We're home for the pandemic. Ask Nancy to call. So Nancy called. I had a great conversation with them. They passed me along to an expert who was the publisher of the local newspaper, the Orcadian. And the Orcadian had covered Skara Brae as a topic, as a feature article in their newspaper since the 1860s. And this guy loved architecture. He loved archaeology. He'd grown up, he'd been on the island for 5 generations. And so he introduced me to other archaeologists, and I was on my way. So the question I wanted to deal with now is, this isn't working again. I'm sorry, guys. Oh, okay. That's going to work?
Oh, you're touching the trackpad, that's why.
Oh, I thought maybe that we should spend a minute talking about what cultural heritage is, because that's what my book is all about. And UNESCO defines cultural heritage in a pretty broad way. It's pretty much anything that humankind has touched. It includes tangible cultural heritage, which is what we all know about: monuments, places, artwork, and so on. There's also intangible cultural heritage: music, language, folk song, stories. And finally, most recently, UNESCO has broadened the definition to include natural cultural heritage, biodiversity, culturally significant landscapes. That was the structure for my book. I figured that I could devote chapters to each of these topics, find somebody who's rescued something amazing, tell their story, I'd have a book. So that's what I did. And that took me through the pandemic. And so I thought I'd tell you about a couple of really interesting things I discovered along the way, writing about Orkney. You can just stay here and do this for me. I don't know. First thing I discovered was about the thank you, the power of stone. Now, Orkney Island is blessed with wonderful stone, and in other communities, Neolithic people in other places, they built with organic material, mostly in Europe, and it doesn't stay around for a long time. So much of Orkney survived because so much of it is made of stone. These Neolithic Orkney people were very imaginative. They didn't have much to work with, but what they had, they used really well. They used stone to craft tombs. They used stones to build ceremonial circles like the one on my cover, which is called the Ring of Brognar. They used stones to make sewing needles, jewelry. They used stones to line the inside of tunnels. If you go to Skara Brae, one of the things you see is there are tunnels leading from one little house to another under these mounds of earth. And that's what people in Skara Brae used to visit their neighbors. going through these underground tunnels when it was cold out, because it can get cold in Orkney. They even used stone for indoor plumbing. At the back of these little huts that I showed you, there are screens that made out of stone. And behind the screens, there are holes in the ground on a stone floor. And what people would do would they'd sort of, do their business in there. They'd throw some water in, and the water would take their waste out along these long pipes into the ocean. Indoor plumbing 6,000 years ago. That strikes me as really exciting. But what's more exciting is when you put it in context. Orkney is part of Scotland. Well, as it turns out, most people in Scotland didn't have indoor plumbing till the middle of the 1800s. But their ancestors did on Orkney. I should tell you that there are many Neolithic sites that have indoor plumbing, but that's at Orkney. So they also created these beautiful and distinctive objects out of cobbles and field stones. These balls happen to be from Orkney. They were found in Orkney. Right now they're at the Scottish National Museum, which is in Edinburgh. You can go see them. But what were they used for? Were they used for weapons? Probably not, because you never find them with chips in them. Were they used as weights? When you were weighing fish and wanted to make sure that you were getting paid properly? No, that wouldn't have worked because they're all different weights. Skara Bray's residents spent a lot of time chipping away at these, so they must have been important to them. But why? Were they used to tell the future? Were they used by oracles? Were they passed around from hand to hand? Did Skara Bray's residents put their stone balls on their stone dressers to impress their visitors? We don't know. We think so. So the Neolithic's creative use of stone is one thing that I found fascinating. The other thing is something that occurred to me when I was about halfway through this chapter. I started thinking about the Neolithic people in Orkney, and I started thinking, how did they get there? We know that life didn't begin on this desolate island in the middle of the North Sea. So how did they get there? And what I discovered was that it appears that some of them actually walked most of the way from Europe. Has anyone ever heard of Doggerland? Yes, great. We have some very well-read people here. I'd never heard of it, but it's a great story. So it's the now disappeared landmass of 18,000 square miles. What's there now is the English Channel and the North Sea, because Doggerland sunk into the ocean many, many millennia ago. It was discovered by a retired geologist around 1900, around that time. And what he actually saw something that everybody who lived in the area saw but never noticed. When the tide went out in that part of the world, what emerged was black soil, and occasionally you would see tree stumps in that soil. You would find bones of animals, bears and wolves. What are bears and wolves doing under the ocean, he asked himself. And as it turns out, the area was actually a land bridge that seamlessly connected Great Britain and continental Europe. There were forests there were settlements, it was a whole way of life. So what happened to Doggerland? Well, global warming happened to Doggerland. Many of the Mesolithic residents of Doggerland were forced to leave because of rising water that engulfed their villages. So archaeologists speculate that some of them walked to what we now know as Scotland. Some of them made it up the coastline. Maybe they saw in the area this beautiful green island, because at the time, Orkney was very green. And they built boats, put their children, their family in, and went off, and their dogs too, English whippets, and went off to Orkney and lived there. And they were hunters and gatherers, but over time, they and other people from other parts of that part of the world settled down and started planting things and raising crops and domesticating some animals. And pretty soon they founded communities like Skara-Brae. But travel to and from Orkney didn't end there. This was Neolithic time was very volatile, very exciting time to live, as it turns out. I thought that with most people, the prevailing view was that Neolithic people lived in isolated settlements, and they didn't even realize there was a larger world out there. But that really isn't true. The Neolithics who lived on Orkney and in Skara-Brae, they visited their friends and family. They got on boats and went and floated around to other islands in Orkney. They even went across the sea to Scotland. It was really a lively time. And people came from those areas to Orkney because Orkney was a center of innovation. It was filled with creatives. They invented the stone circle. They invented the stone balls. These are really happening people. And we know it because of Stonehenge. Here's why we know it because of Stonehenge. Stonehenge, which is shaped very much like these circles, stone circles, happened 300 years after the ones on Orkney. The ones on Orkney predate Stonehenge by 300 years. So people think that some folks from Great Britain actually came or knew about the stone circles and replicated that in Great Britain. Most people think that technology traveled north from Great Britain to Scotland, but Stonehenge proves, perhaps, that it was the other way around, that for a brief period, Orkney was the center of the universe. So, I think we have to thank the Laird of Brecknock for rescuing Skara-Brae from certain oblivion. Now, he may not have known at the time he was doing it, but his actions set up a chain of events that came up to the present day and ended up with this part of the world being a World Heritage Site, which means it's one of the most cherished and important places on Earth because it's a World Heritage Site. And so to me, he's a rescuer, and he's a hero, and he's one of those rare people who, for some reason, saved some important part of the world, some important cultural heritage. So learning about he and the other rescuers, I have a curated set of 7 in the book, really shows the importance of cultural heritage, I think. Each of the chapters in my book focuses on a single person, but all of them connect to the most challenging issues facing cultural heritage today. Let me just show you, I hope. There he is. This is Louis Shotridge. He was an Alaskan, a royal from the Tlingit culture in Alaska, and he was also a curator trained at the University of Pennsylvania Museum. He worked there from around 1913, 1914 to the middle of the 1930s. And what most of his job was going back to his friends and family in Alaska and buying their cultural treasures and their ceremonial objects and telling them that they will be safer at the University of Pennsylvania in the museum. And in fact, he was right, but now his descendants, Shortridge's descendants, want them back. And legally, they're entitled to them under law. So there's been a very interesting back and forth with Shortridge's descendants and the University of Pennsylvania. And I have to tell you that after having researched this for a very long time, that the way Penn is treating it is this matter of dispute over cultural treasures is about as good as you can get. These people, the Penn and the Tlingit people have reached a wonderful compromise that works to the benefit of both of these societies, as well as preserving these important treasures, some of which are back in Alaska, and many of which remain at Penn for us to enjoy in Philadelphia. The next slide is a totally different kind of cultural issue, and that is war. War damages cultural property, and you don't see it any place more than right now in Ukraine. The Russians are doing whatever they can to wipe out not only the communities, but also the cultural heritage of Ukraine. This here is a group of people who are working against that. Have many of you heard about the storied monuments men of World War II, right? What they did was were a troupe of curators and museum registrars and art museum directors, and so professors who were put together by the federal government, by the army, to go into Europe right after the Germans retreated, right during the time of the German retreat, and to find all of the millions of treasures that the Germans stole from different countries and from Jewish people. Those were the monuments men. What I didn't realize is that those monuments men have been reconstituted today. So the Army Reserves are recruiting professors, historians, art historians, curators, archivists, and sending them through a training program, giving them the rank, an officer's rank, a lieutenant, and so that they can work in war-torn countries and during natural disasters to help people save their heritage. Now, we can't go into Ukraine because we're not part of the war, right? But you're amazed what we can do. And so I wrote a chapter about these culture warriors, focusing on one of them, the woman in the back in purple. Her name is Corey Wegner, and she is a Army major and an art historian. And when I interviewed her, I thought, this is quite a story. And many of the people involved in cultural heritage preservation and rescue are women, and they are fierce. So, why do we do this? Culture is the story we tell ourselves about ourselves, and cultural heritage makes that real and concrete. These archaeological sites, structures, monuments, museums, even natural landscapes, they reveal who we are and what we value, and they are fragile. Though when one is lost, it's lost forever. Take Skara Brae. Though it doesn't look like it, the site is actually very fragile, and I'll tell you why. I'll give you a couple of facts. In 2019, the year I was there, I came during October, but if I had come a couple months before, I would have been greeted by some of the 140 cruise ships that come every year to this tiny island. In 2018, 112,000 people visited Skara Brae. Now, when you compare 112 or 120,000 people to the numbers that Pompeii gets, it sounds like very little, right? Well, certainly enough. Over-tourism is enough to put these sites at risk because footfalls can damage the area around them, causing erosion. It's really a challenge there, especially since Orkney depends very heavily on tourism. So over-tourism is one threat to a place like Skara Brae, but there's another, and that's global warming. It's the same issue that sunk Doggerland, some 8,000 years ago. And it's no less of a risk today. This time we're responsible. Can I have the next slide? This is another view of Skara Brae, and you can see it's right next to the ocean. I heard a story from an archaeologist that I interviewed. He was walking very close to this area, and he saw, after a big rainstorm, a village that sort of appeared in the cliffs. The next time he came to see it, it was gone. It had fallen into the sea. And that's what can happen to a place like Skara Brae. Unless things change, and change quickly, on a dark and stormy night, 100, 200 years in the future, Skara Brae will be no more. It will have been swept into the cold Atlantic Ocean. Thank you. So, are there any questions? Yes?
So where does this fit on the timeline with New Grange and now Fidelity in Ireland?
Good question. I think that they're more or less around the same time. Those are Neolithic sites, too. Yeah. Yes?
Don't forget Maytown, and that there's also a barrow grave there, similar to New Grange, those and those in Ireland. And it's also a great place to see birds, and World War II.
Yes.
And World War I because the Germans couldn't so much.
That's right. Orkney, thank you for that. Orkney was a major military site during World War I, and especially during World War II. There were 60,000 troops stationed in Orkney during the war, and there's remnants of that there too. I decided that maybe you didn't need to have a travelogue of Orkney, so I focused on Skara Brae. Yes, Peggy.
There is a friend from our neighborhood who will be absolutely fascinated in this, named Piers Gore. His parents, Carter Gore was head of the Civic Association in a law firm here, and his mother, Joanne, was a guide. But Pierce at college studied medieval history and fell absolutely in love with the Orkneys, where for about 20 years he has had a home, but able only to get there when he wasn't working as a lawyer at either Penn or Franklin and Marshall. He knows this area. He knows the people too. He will love your story. So, Pierce Gore.
Thank you so much for telling me about him.
Nancy, what are the other cultural sites that your book covers?
Well, I wrote about Iraq, about a collection called the Iraqi Jewish Archive. The Jews lived in Iraq since Babylon, since Babylonian times. It was the oldest community and one of the wealthiest in the Middle East, and they were driven out. So around the time of World War II, and then when Israel was founded. They were just pushed out. And so they had to leave everything behind. And when the US came to Iraq, invaded in 2003, they discovered a trove of these remnants of this community floating in the water in Saddam Hussein's intelligence bureau. So what happened to those? What are these Iraqi Jews? What was their story? That's one chapter. That's another chapter. There's another chapter about endangered species, because I thought that was an important issue to cover. And it's about the return of the peregrine falcon, which is the fastest bird on Earth. And that's a really cool story about how DDT destroyed the peregrine falcon, and how a guy from Cornell University saved it and brought it back over time. So those are two additional examples of stories in the book. Beulah. I'm rescuing the rescuers, Beulah says. It feels noble. It really does. This book, it took over 4 years to write. And I have to tell you, during the pandemic, part of the time it was a slog. But when I came back to it and started remembering these amazing people that I had discovered, and people in the field know about these stories and these sites, but most of us don't, I just felt like I was making a major contribution, small, but important, to the world of cultural heritage preservation. So thanks for asking that question. Yes? Michael?
Is there a sequel or a series in the works?
I don't know. You mean, do I have another book in mind?
Well, just to follow, there obviously are many more sites that would be appropriate.
That is a really good question. I'm going to have to think about that and get back to you. I'm not sure I'm quite up to it now, but who knows? Yes. Larry, do you want to stand up? No. Okay.
Researching these stories and getting to know these people, these rescuers, what do they have in common, if anything?
I thought that they were all motivated by altruism. They're not all motivated by altruism. They're very different motives. So they don't have that in common. I guess what they have in common is that they have something that speaks to their desire to reach beyond themselves and to do something that is important for society as a whole, something that they're not necessarily personally connected with. So that's, I think, is what the answer to that one is. You can see it more or less more in some people than others. Yes? My publisher is Rowman and Littlefield, which is now part of Bloomsbury. So that's who's going to publish my books in the future. It's very good press. Rowman and Littlefield's a good press, too. It's the largest publisher of museum books in the world. So, next door, there's a wonderful reception, great food, and I'll be signing books for those who'd like them. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Nancy. I get to be the bodyguard, so I'm going to take Nancy through there to sign the book. So if you want to talk to Nancy while you're here, please go to the book signing spot, buy a book, and stand in line and have a wonderful conversation with Nancy. I wanted to mention, Nancy and I have talked about this before. I think it was around February 27th or 28th, 2020. We held the book launch for her last book. That was one of the very last programs we held before the pandemic changed all of our lives forever. And it was a packed space like this. So it is so wonderful to see the community that not only Nancy has built, because I know so many of you here because you adore Nancy, but also the interest that you all have in her subjects, which are also get to the heart of what the Athenaeum is about. So thank you all for being here. Please go over and enjoy the reception. Buy a book for yourself, for anyone you love. Valentine's Day. You can buy someone a healthy salad to eat and a book about saving the world. And so please buy yourself a book, buy a book for someone you love. We'll see you over there. Thank you for being here tonight. So.